There is something in writing called the false victory. This is where you get to the climax of the story, the tension in the story breaks, and suddenly the tension is ramped up as we see that the antagonist has not been defeated. I'm not a fan of false victories, and I'm going to be talking about why I don't like them and why, in general, they should not be implemented in your writing. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppie. You can find out more about me at danielpoppie.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. As I stated in the intro, I am not a fan of false victories. I talked about this in my episode on the 7-point plot structure, so if you want to check that out and you're watching this, you can check it out up here. If you're listening, it'll be down below. I don't like false victories for a very specific reason. I'm not someone who likes to tell people how they should do their writing, so if you think that you can fit a false victory into your writing better, and you know something I don't know, I think you should run with that, because I think that I don't know everything there is to know about writing. But as I think about false victories, I've rarely ever seen one that I actually like in the story, and I think the reason I don't like them has to do with how stories work more than my own personal preferences. So I think that when we're talking about this, we need to talk about how stories work and how they look. And if we look at the basic story structure, we have the beginning of a story, the catalyst, the inciting incident. And from that inciting incident to the climax of the story, we have rising action. And then after that climax, there's what we call the falling action, where the tension breaks. In my episode on the 3 parts of a story, I talk about this more in depth. So if you want to know more about that, you can check it out in that episode. But when we look at how the story works, we see that rising action continues until the climax of the story. We go from a place of tension to a point where the tension breaks. There's a change in the story that changes the direction of the story. If you draw out the story as a triangle, the peak of the triangle is the climax of the story, and the falling action is after that peak. So in a typical story without any false victory, how it works is we get to that climax, we have the resolution of the story, we know the answer to our question, we know whether the hero or the antagonist has won, and then we see the results of that victory or defeat. If we have a false victory, we have a similar construction. We have the rising action of the story ramping up to that climax, we break the tension, and then once we break the tension, we see the initial results of that climax. We see how our questions have been answered initially, but then there's a point in the story where we ramp up the tension again. And every time I run into this construction within a story, it feels like the writer has slammed on the brakes and then gunned the gas immediately after. I think there are 2 big issues when it comes to false victories. First, we do not have the time to build the tension appropriately. When you're writing a book, you take 100, 200, 300, some people take 1,000 pages to get to the climax of the book. You can certainly write a story that is much shorter. You can write a story that is only a paragraph long, but when you are dealing with a longer story, the rising action takes longer because the story is more complex. We need to take our time. When we do a false victory in a story, what we are doing is, like I said before, we're slamming on the brakes, and then we are trying to ramp up our story to the same level or a greater amount of tension than we had before. So there is a very odd juxtaposition of the tension breaking and then this sudden resurgence of tension in our story. And I think this breaks the flow. People expect false victories in stories these days, but at the same time, their natural interaction with stories is to have that more relaxed state after the tension is broken. They do react emotionally. They do get more tense when they're watching something that has a false victory in it because they suddenly realize that everything has not been resolved. But there is not the same amount of satisfaction in the audience compared to the breaking of the tension after a long time building that tension. It's kind of a cheap way to ramp up the tension and then break it again. And I think the audience feels cheated out of that whole entire period where the tension was ramping up and up and up until the climax came. I compare the false victory to a jump scare. You might get the person's blood going. You might get the person riled up because of a jump scare in a horror film. But the horror films that stick with us, that have the most effect on the audience, get under our skin. And it's the same thing with any other type of story. Those stories that affect people the most take time to build. They take time to present their characters. They take time, individual steps, to bring the audience to the point of the climax of the story where we see what is going to happen to those characters. What does the false victory add to that story? I would say it adds very little. I would say it adds just about as much as a jump scare. It might make the audience be afraid, but a few seconds after that scare is gone, the audience is back to their stasis. The best horror films are the ones that keep people up at night. The best stories are the ones that leave the audience with deep emotion during the falling action of that story. As I said, there were two major reasons why I didn't think the false victory was a good thing to use. The first thing I said before was that we need to build the tension to make the breaking of that tension satisfying. And the second one, as I said during this as well, is that this is a manufactured thing. This is not something that gets to the heart of what is going on in the story. It's something we tack on to the end of the story, and it's a throwaway feature of the story, if you can see it that way. If you took out the false victory, would the story change much? Would the story be better or worse? That is really the question. And when you ask the question, it's not whether you feel a lot of tension in the moment between that climax and the false victory. The question is, if I take out that false victory, is the story going to be more satisfying to the audience in the long run? And I say that I don't think it will. I say that it doesn't. I think this all goes back to this idea that the audience understands the tension to be broken after the climax. The audience understands how a story works on an almost instinctual level, and when we break the tension and then ramp it back up, it's not satisfying for the audience. Though the audience might get excited, though the audience might get their heart pumping, at the same time, it's not fitting within how they understand how stories work. So what I would suggest, and again, you write how you want to write, but I just think that the false victory does not fit in the structure of a story. I think that on the most basic level of what a story is, it just does not work how a story works. I think it's something that is outside a story. I think it's something that we add on. But if you want to try this out and you have a false victory in a story you're writing, consider extending the rising action to the point of that false victory, add a few more things in, or even consider cutting that false victory out to see if the story is better without it. Now, I'm not going to say definitively that every single story with a false victory uses it in a way that does not work. It's just that as I thought about this episode, as I thought about this topic, I could not think of one instance where I actually think the false victory was satisfying in the story. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppie, and this is How to Write Good.